Real quick before we jump into things, I just wanted to kind of just share something with you. I mean, a lot of people have a lot of different views of Netcast, and we confuse the mess out of people. Some people think that we're like a clothing store in the mall. Other people think we're a coffee shop in the mall. Other people don't know what we are, but we're in the mall, so we must be a cult because they heard that we were a church. Other people think that we're a church, which we are. Other people think we're a coffee shop, which we are. But there is a group of people all among the North Shore that actually see Netcast solely as a basketball team. I don't know if you know this or not. For real, this is a real thing. So we have this slogan, if you can't beat us, join us, 9-11-1. And so anyway, yesterday, a good friend of mine by the name of Nick Lanier, a buddy of mine, he had two of his really close friends pass away in drug overdoses, one in 2016 and one in 2018. And what he decided to do was he was going to put together a basketball tournament that he kind of like runs. And so as a good friend, we were so eager and so happy to kind of support that and sponsor some of it. And we even agreed to put a team in. And so we put a team in and we played ball yesterday. And I can barely move today because I don't know I think we have a picture because this squad right here, sorry it's a little blurry, but we won first place. Your church, okay? Your church gave people buckets yesterday, okay? I just felt like, and I told my guys, I was like, listen, I just can't wait to like tell my church because, most church leagues and most church teams are whack. They just are, but not your church, okay? Your church took home the trophy, okay? The trophy today. And so anyway, we won for the fourth annual Sweat for Sweat. That was one of Nick's best friends who passed away. His nickname was Sweat. The fourth annual Sweat for Sweat Addiction Awareness Tournament. There were 8 or 10 teams. No, I think there was 10 teams in there. I could be wrong. 8 or 10 teams. I mean, we're talking competitive ball. Like, this is like, right, Cody? Cleve, right? We wouldn't let Cleve play. Cleve's a good basketball player. He just ain't good enough. But your church, we came through yesterday, okay? So like, yes, all right, it happened. I just wanted to share it. I couldn't hold that on for just me. I was like, this is like a family victory. Like, we all got the dub. So anyway, if you got a Bible, we're going to be in John chapter 19 today. This is not going to be a sermon illustration. We're just going to leave that here in case any of those dudes that we played against pop online, like we tell them to. I just want them to know that we haven't forgotten yet. So we're going to be in John chapter 19 today. If you got a Bible, I'd love for you to turn there with me. Today we're going to find ourselves actually in 2 of the last 3 chapters of John's gospel. Jesus has been taken by corrupt soldiers. He's been illegally put on trial by the Jews. The Jews want him dead. They don't have authority to kill him, so they're not really sure exactly how to do this. And so they bring Jesus to this local Roman governor. His name's Pilate. And Pilate does have the authority to sentence Jesus to death. Pilate, though, when interviewing Jesus, thinks he's innocent. But the Jews are forcing his hand to have Jesus killed. And so to try to appease the Jews, what Pilate does, we've gone over some of this. I'm just kind of giving us context and recapping a little bit. But what Pilate does is he begins to just beat Jesus within an inch of his life. He has him flogged, 39 lashes with something called the cat o' nine tails, which I went over a couple weeks ago. And so he's absolutely been brutally beaten. He's then represented to the Jews. He's mangled, he's disfigured, he's got a crown of thorns on his head, and still the Jewish leaders aren't satisfied. They want him crucified. So Pilate washes his hands of responsibility, gives him to the Jews to be crucified. And at his crucifixion site, Jesus is hung on a cross with nails being pierced through his wrists and his ankle joints. After a few hours, he speaks these final last words, right, where he says, "It is finished." He breathes his final breath. A Roman soldier who's a professional understander, he's a professional at understanding death, confirms that Jesus is dead. And that's where we're going to find ourselves picking it up in John chapter 19 today. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about John, the gospel writer, the one who wrote what we're going to read today. I think it's always important to get as much context from of the text before we dive into it. So therefore, when I just start reading the text, it makes a lot more sense. And so a couple things about John that we know. We know John was Jewish. We know that he met Jesus when he was about 16 or 17 years old. He was a teenager. We also know that over about 3.5 years, the two of them, Jesus and John, became the best of friends. We also know that when John sat down to write his account of the life and the ministry of Jesus, each word that he penned, he wrote as a Jewish man trying to convince the Jewish people around him, right? He was a minister or a missionary to the Jews, that Jesus was the Christ, the coming Messiah, the Savior that the Old Testament pointed to. And he tells us this in John chapter 20, verse 31. He says, I've written all these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing that you may have life in his name. And in effect, what John is saying, he's saying is, I'm not writing these things to just inform you. I'm not just trying to give you facts or entertain you with some cool stories. I'm writing to you as a believing Jew to help you see that Jesus is the Christ. And not only do I want you to believe it because it's true, but I actually want you to see it so you can experience the most fulfilling life imaginable, that you may have life in his name. And so before we get to John chapter 19 and John chapter 20, where we're going to be today, I want to show you from the Old Testament one of the main reasons why John, who was Jewish, believed that Jesus was the Christ, okay? Because I think that makes sense, and there's a lot of correlation in the Old Testament and New Testament, specifically in the last two chapters that we've been going over, 19 and 20. And so if you're a first century Jew, you have been extremely well-versed in the Old Testament scriptures. You just would have been. It's kind of like how Americans, there's certain songs we know. You know the Star Spangled Banner, right? You know the Pledge of Allegiance. There's certain things that you know you were raised in. Right? You may not even understand what all the words mean when you say a pledge of allegiance or to the flag. You may not know, you could recite it, you may not understand it all, but you know it. And one of the things that the Old Testament scriptures did was it painted this picture of the coming Christ. And so that when he did come, this Savior, he'd be recognized. And so what John does in chapter 19 and 20 is he helps us to see the correlation between the Old Testament depiction of the coming Christ and Jesus. He even says in the beginning was the Word. Everybody would have known Genesis chapter 1 where it says in the beginning was God, right? And he says and the Word was with God and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And so there's little kind of hints at this all throughout John's gospel. And so to help us see it most clearly, I want to just read to you a prophecy from Isaiah that speaks of the coming Christ. Many of you have heard this stuff before, but I just want to read it so that we kind of get an idea of really what John was trying to do as he wrote the 19th and 20th chapter. So in Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 15, this won't be on the screen, but just kind of, maybe it will be on the screen actually. I just looked up and I was like, oh, by the way, I have what's called a confidence monitor back there. It actually doesn't give me much confidence because it has a countdown. And anytime there's a countdown, you're not confident. You know what I'm saying? You're like, 4, 3, 2, right? Okay. So anyway, so Isaiah chapter 52, verses 13 and 15, it says, behold, my servant shall act wisely. And one of the things that we know about Jesus is at the age of 12, he was teaching teachers in the temple. And as an adult, his enemies would be the first to say that it was impossible to outwit him, right? So my servant shall be acting wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. This means he'd be honored by many and have massive crowds following him. Verse 14 says, but as many were astonished, although he'd be honored and beloved, it says something horrific would happen to him. It says his appearance would become as one who was marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. And this points to what he's experienced in John chapter 19, where he was flogged and how unrecognizable he'd become. Verse 15 says, so shall he sprinkle many nations. And this is telling us that despite the horrors that would happen to him, his influence, more specifically the sprinkling of his blood, would spread beyond Israel, not just that nation, but nations beyond. Isaiah 53 says this, starting in verse 2, says he'd have no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He'd look like a regular, ordinary, common man, right? Jesus was born in poverty. He lived in a small town. He had no political or family clout. It wasn't like people were like, oh yeah, that dude's from, he's from Mary and Joseph. No, there was none of that. It says he'd be despised and rejected by men, as one from whom men hid their faces. He'd be despised and we esteemed it not. That although he's worthy of our honor and respect, he's going to be rejected, despised. The whole city, if you remember, was yelling, crucify him, crucify him. It says he'd be pierced for our transgressions. This is a clear picture of the nailing to the cross. That wasn't even a thing yet when this was written. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, he's like a sheep that before it shears is silent, so he'd open not his mouth. That Pilate, if you remember, he gave Jesus an opportunity to talk his way out of his own judgment, but what did Jesus do? He stood silent. It says that they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. In other words, he would die a wicked person's death, a criminal's death, but in his death, he'd be treated like a rich man. And we're going to see that today. And all this would be done to him, and it says, although he had done no violence. In other words, he'd suffer a violent, mutilating death, but have no violence on his record. And so I share this to say that it's wild to me that the Jews' favorite prophet, Isaiah is known as like the favorite prophet. He really is. That Isaiah could give such a clear picture of the coming Christ, yet they were so blind when he stood right before their eyes. And so we're going to pick it up in John chapter 19 and start in verse 38. We're going to go through verse 20 through 18, or chapter 20, 18. It says this. It says, after these things, Joseph, I'm going to try to pronounce this, of Arimatha. Maybe any scholars in here? How'd I do? Arimathea. Shoot. I knew she'd be here. I knew it. We're just going to call him Joseph. After these things, Joseph, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. I love how John is hilarious in this chapter. In the next, you're going to see, it's just funny. I love how he just throws shade at Joseph. Like, yeah, he was a disciple. He was undercover, though. Okay. Joseph asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he, Joseph, came and took away his body. Nicodemus, also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, the details of that are in John chapter 3. He came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloe, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloth with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and every garden has a gardener. Remember that, because that'll matter in a little bit. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So what seems to have happened here really quickly, not going to take a lot of time, is that this guy Joseph, who was a wealthy guy, kind of like Jesus, but was a little bit private about it. He had previously purchased this grave site, likely for himself, but given the circumstances at hand, he decided to donate his tomb to Jesus so he can have an honorable burial. Now, this is cool, because had he not done this, Jesus' body would likely have been taken down, carried outside of the city, and burned with the trash. This is what they did to most criminals who were crucified. Chapter 20, verse 1 says this. Now, on the first day of the week, Sunday, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Now, it's dark outside. They don't have electricity. They don't have street lights, right? But immediately she knows something fishy's going on. Something shady's happening, and here's why. First, Pilate, he made sure that the tomb was closed. He stationed Roman guards in front of it, right? A Roman seal was placed on it, which meant if anyone illegally messed with this tomb, it would be seen as national treason and punishable by death. So it's highly unlikely that grave robbers were showing up to a grave that was guarded to steal the body, okay? Secondly, the reason she thinks something fishy's going on is the Jews had this law that said a person is ceremonially unclean. And if they had come in contact with a dead body. And so, which means that they would be excommunicated from the Jewish community. So chances are the Jews that loved Jesus or even hated Jesus likely wouldn't mess with the body of Jesus. And so the only conclusion that Mary seems to come up with is like something mysterious is going on. There's some conspiracy that's taking place, and they're moving Jesus' body. It says in verse 2, so she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple. That other disciple is most likely, almost every theologian believes that this is written by John, and John is speaking of himself here. So that other disciple is John, who's writing the gospel, which is funny because look how he describes himself next. He's the one who Jesus loved. Apparently, John wants to know who's loved the most. Okay. And Mary said to him, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, John, and they were going towards the tomb. Both of them were running together. But a little competitive side note here. The other disciple, John, who's writing this, wants you to know that he outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I mean, I just love it. Like, side note, right? This has nothing to do with anything spiritual at all. Here's John, 40 years after this happens, writing down the details of the things that he remembers, and he's like, I won that race, right? I mean, which is kind of crazy, right? We're talking 40 years later, Peter had already been crucified upside down for following Jesus at this point, and still what's strumming through his mind is not, oh man, remember Peter. It's like, I'll see Peter in a little bit, but I'm gonna remind him even then, I beat you, bro. I just love it because I love how human and honest the scriptures are, right? Again, no point at all, just an observation. It says, "And stooping to look in, John saw the linen cloth lying there, but he did not go in," right? Oh, now we're having an honest moment. My man was fast, but the dude was a little spooked to crawl into the tomb. Then Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. Peter might be slow, but he's no punk. He crawls right in. He saw the linen cloth lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloth, but folded up in its place by itself. Now, listen, there are two miracles going on here. The first is that Jesus rose from the dead, but the second is this, and this is probably why John was so spooked. A single man folded his clothes. That's crazy. That is an act of God. And so what Peter finds is that the face cloth had been removed, folded up neatly, and put it off to the side of the tomb. And that might be why John freaked out, right? He had never seen a single man fold his clothes ever in his life. Moving on. Verse 8. So then the other disciple, John, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. Believed what? He believed that Jesus was alive. And I'll explain some of this in a little bit. For as yet they did not understand the scriptures that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. And when she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. Now, we could assume that she didn't know that they were angels because she doesn't seem to be the least bit surprised. It says, they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Verse 14 says, having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And that's a great question for us, right? Who are we seeking? Supposing him to be the gardener, because every garden has a gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." And immediately at the sound of her name, it says she turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me." Sounds insensitive, okay? But it's not, and I'm going to explain that in a minute too. "For I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. All right. I got 5 things that I really want to show us from this, 5 things that I believe that John was trying to show us. The first 3 are probably going to be very, very quick. The first I want us to see comes out of verse 38. They talk about Joseph. Joseph was a disciple with Jesus, but he was a disciple, and he was a disciple secretly because of fear, right? John even goes out of his way to tell us this. He's throwing some shade at Joseph's way, but at the same time, he keeps Joseph in this because he wants us to realize something about Joseph. Joseph, who was a closet follower of Jesus, eventually manned up and came and went public. I think that's pretty cool. Again, I think John wanted us to know there was this Joseph. He was a closet follower of Jesus, and he manned up, and he decided, no, I'm going public with this, okay? We have baptisms on September 18th. Baptism is going public. In the Christian faith, baptism is going public, right? The first step of going public with Jesus is obviously we believe in Jesus, right? And then we are baptized. It's declaring that you are a follower of Jesus, right? It's a picture of our allegiance, our commitment. It's about going public with our relationship with Jesus. Too many people in New England are closet followers of Jesus, okay? It's just everywhere. right? I want you to picture this. Imagine a husband who doesn't want to go public with his wife. Think about that. We're the bride of Christ. Imagine a bride that doesn't want to go out into public with her husband, right? Oh, babe, yeah, let's just stay inside. No, let's just watch a movie at home. I don't want to go out together because I don't want people seeing that we're a thing. That's an insult, right? Would you agree? Some of you got some weird marriages because not everybody in here said yes. That's an insult. And I do wonder if Jesus ever feels insulted because in private we're all about identifying with Jesus and with the right crowd, I'm cool with just being cool with Jesus. But when it's public, we got to be careful now. I think that's a little insulting if I was Jesus, okay? I just think John wanted us to see that. Second thing, John was more loved, he thought, and faster than Peter, and Peter had more courage, right? You see this in the text. I already talked about it. I'm not going to spend much time on this at all. I just want you to know that I don't think John was throwing shade at Peter. I think John was just highlighting the difference that him and Peter had. Peter has some courage, he has some speed. And I think as Christians, we got to stop looking over the shoulder and seeing what we don't have and being frustrated we don't have it and be content and cool with what God has given us. Actually, in Romans chapter 12, it says this, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." That's a crazy thought. That God has given you, assigned to you, a measure of faith. Stop looking stop scrolling Instagram and, oh my gosh, I wish I had that. I wish I was like that. No. It says this. It says, "For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them." Right? Just quick, I think John was celebrating some very practical things. Peter was a little bit older and slow, had some weight on him. I was a young buck and I was quick. But when Peter got there, he was the one that went in first. I was terrified. That's okay. God has uniquely designed them differently, and he wants us to use the gifts that we have. Period. We just move on from there, okay? Third thing. John believed that Jesus was alive before seeing Jesus alive. This is unique to John. We don't get the hint of that at all with any of his disciples except John. So in the original language, in the Greek, right, there are 6 different verbs that can be translated to see or saw, right? 3 of the 6 verbs are used in this passage. And all of the 3 have different definitions and different meanings and are meant to be used to communicate different things. I'm going to read these to you and help you see it. Verse 20 says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb." That word "saw" in the original language is defined as observing without necessarily understanding. Okay? Then in verse 6 of chapter 20, it says, "Then Simon Peter came, followed him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself." And here the word "saw" means he examined for the purpose of investigation. Make sense? Verse 8 says, "Then the other disciple, John, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed." Now again, a different verb in the Greek, and this time it means perceived with full understanding. And so what John is trying to communicate to us is that when he walked in, he saw something and got it. It clicked. He put it all together. He realized Jesus has risen from the dead. And he may have said that to Peter. He may have said it to Mary. He may have run home and said it to everybody else, and I doubt any of them believed him. But he is letting us know, I was the first to believe because I didn't even see the risen Christ. I just saw what I saw in there, and I was like, he's back. Now, as I studied this week, I was fascinated by what John saw, Okay, so originally I had always thought that John walked into the tomb and saw a bunch of linen cloths like laying around, sitting on the floor, somewhere, and there was this one folded little garment of the headpiece that was sitting there, and as if somebody kind of came in and unraveled Jesus and folded everything up neatly that needed to be, but then there was this pile. I just thought it was kind of like this weird. I just thought of it differently than it actually was, but because that's not what the depiction is. So there's a reason why John goes out of his way to tell us that Nicodemus, this is verse 39, Nicodemus came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloe, about 75 pounds in weight, and they took the body of Jesus and they bound it in linen cloth with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. The reason why John tells us that is to help us understand what he saw when he walked in the tomb. This was fascinating to me. This may not be fascinating to you. This is fascinating to me. So, ancient people weren't as shielded from death as we are today, okay? So nowadays, we hire people in funeral homes and they take care of the dead bodies. But in the first century, people prepared their own dead for burial. And by the time you were about 30 years old, you would have seen at this point dozens of corpses up close and personal. It wouldn't have been a weird thing. And it would have been a sad thing, but not a weird thing. And you would have been, I guess I'll say, familiar with the burial customs, okay? And what they would do in the first century is they would wrap the body up in a large linen cloth, and they'd wrap the body up to the neck. And then they would soak the cloth in a mixture of spiced resin, okay? John tells us that they used 75 pounds worth of good-smelling spices to drown out the smell of death, right? So that's buckets. That's a lot. Thanks, Kev. That's buckets, 75 pounds. So then they would tie a separate cloth around the face, right? Be considered a face cloth, and it would tie underneath the chin and then be draped over its head to cover the decomposing face so that you would be able to see who it was. If you ever were to go back in there, you'd be able to see who it was and possibly recognize the face before it was decomposed, okay? And what happened, or what would happen, is after about 2 or 3 days, this linen cloth that was soaked in 75 pounds of resin would harden and become kind of like a modern day cast, right? You break your arm, you have a cast put on it, and it hardens. So what John is telling us is that when he walked into the tomb, this is crazy to me. When he walked into the tomb, what he saw was a hollow, hard shell of a mummified body with no body inside, like a cocoon, okay? And next to it was this folded up face cloth. What do you do with that? Like what do you do with that? And so for John, he's like, yo, when I saw that, I didn't even need to see Jesus. I saw that, I was like, he's back, yo. He's got to be back. I ain't seen him yet, but he's back. And Peter, you got to think about Peter. Peter had just denied Jesus to his face 3 times, then dipped out. Peter's like, nah, he ain't back. He ain't back. Right? Right? Why does John want us to know that it was then that he believed? Well, here we are, 40 years after the resurrection, and those who saw Jesus walking the earth after he was crucified are beginning to die off. And what John is doing is he's telling his readers that they can believe in the resurrection without visibly seeing the risen Christ, because there's evidence. And for us, that's extremely hopeful, because we too can't lay our eyes on the risen Christ. He can open our eyes for us to know and believe, right? But what John is telling us here is, yo, you don't need to see him to believe. There's evidence. There's evidence. It's okay. Just look at the evidence. And I don't have time to outline all of the evidence right now. But if you truly are seeking Jesus, let me just tell you this. If you seek him, you'll find him. Not just because he opens your eyes, but he will open your eyes. He may open your eyes. But there's plenty of evidence. All right, 4th thing I want us to see is this. Mary receives Jesus by grace, okay? It says Mary turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. And Jesus says to her, Mary. And immediately at the sound of her name, man, that touched me because my favorite verse, Isaiah 43:1, fear not, for I've redeemed you. I've called you by name. You are mine. At the sound of her name, she turns and says to him, teacher. So I don't know if you know this, but most Catholic theologians believe that Mary Magdalene was the woman that was caught in the act of adultery in John chapter 8. Whether or not that's true or not, we have no idea. But the Catholics believe it, so we'll just talk about that. Do you also know that many theologians think that it was Mary who was considered the prostitute in Luke chapter 7, or the sinner, because they want to just kind of dumb it down, but she's considered a prostitute in Luke chapter 7, who anointed Jesus' feet with oil and wiped it up with her hair. Many theologians believe that as well. Do you also know that in Luke chapter 8, we're told that Jesus cast 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene? 7 demons. That word, that number 7, for us, it means like numerically 7. For them, it means in that time, in time and day, it meant like mega, right? It was like there was just, Jesus had to take a lot out of that woman. You know what I'm saying? It was like, you know what I'm saying? Mega. Okay. And I don't know if you know this also, but at this time in history, a woman's testimony could not be used in the court of law. And yet, Jesus deliberately chooses this woman, Mary, who is not a pillar of the community, to be the first eyewitness of his resurrection. How much clearer can Jesus be that you see him and are saved by him simply by grace? How much clearer can Jesus be in saying that this grace can be received by anyone who will believe? Anyone. Mary is an outsider. She's an outcast. She represents the immoral crowd. She's a part of the marginalized people. Yet none of that matters, right? It doesn't matter your pedigree, doesn't matter your past, your gender, it doesn't matter your class. You receive Jesus by absolute sheer grace. Period. Period. There's no works involved. So if you come here and you start hearing, you start thinking, I'm a Jesus follower, you know what I'm saying? Because I'm like kind of good, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? Or you start getting mad at people because they're not as good as you are, and you say you follow Jesus, and you're like, you need to do better. Da, da, da. You're not recognizing that you are who you are by the grace of God. Period. Period. And then the fifth thing that I see here is just how Mary's understanding of grace led to this explosion of love. Verse 16 says, Jesus said to her, Mary, and immediately at the sound, she turns and says, teacher. And she must have just grabbed him and wouldn't let him go, because the next verse says, Jesus says to her, don't cling to me. Now, some of you married that person, right? You're like, hey, baby, you're like, chill. Give me some space, right? At first glance, it seems that that's what Jesus is saying. It seems like he's like, hey, don't touch me. There have even been some crazies out there that have built theologies around this, as if Jesus, he was in transition into his holy state and like she's going to mess it up. It's just weird. He is not worried about being touched, just so we're clear. Actually, the verb used here means stop clinging so tightly. And it's kind of almost funny, right? It's almost as Jesus like, oh, Mary, you're squeezing kind of hard, like chill, ow, And as soon as Mary realized he was back, she must have just grabbed a hold of him like a vice. And do you blame her? I mean, we're talking about a woman who used to walk the streets, may have worked a corner. By many was considered out of her mind, a lunatic, psychotic, walking around talking to herself, crying, likely begging for money. And here she is, changed, different now. Thinking that the one who changed her is gone forever. And then she sees him. She sees the one who made her whole again. And she is exploding with love at the sight of Jesus. She loves him so much, right? And the truth is, the degree to which you understand the depth of your depravity. See, a lot of us, we come in here thinking not soberly about ourselves. We think way too highly of ourselves. And the truth is, the degree to which you understand the depth of your depravity and the magnitude of his grace is the degree to which love will just explode out of you at the thought of Jesus. You want to know how I know that I deeply love Jesus? It's my litmus test. It's not because I'm a pastor of a church. It's not because I'm still a pastor of a church. It's not because I read my Bible from time to time. It's not because I preach the Bible time to time. It's not because I do Christian things or listen to Christian music or like I'm a nicer guy than my neighbor. Not you, Dave. Dave's nicer than me. I know that I know that I know that I love Jesus because anytime I think about or sing about or tell others about where I was and who I was before Jesus and how much the grace of Jesus has changed me, even right now, it just stirs up deep emotion. Like after 22 years of following Jesus, I'm just still not over it. I'm not over the gospel. And the truth is, if the message of Jesus does not move you, if it's not deeply personal to you, if it's only truth and not spirit, if it doesn't possess the power to move you emotionally or stir you emotionally, if it's only theological to you or intellectual to you, then I don't know how real it is to you. Some of you say, oh man, it's just a personality thing. It's just a personality thing. You were made in the image of God, who grieves and has joy and gets happy. I promise you, your personality, the people around you would say, your personality consists of, at times, stirred emotions. And if the message of Jesus doesn't possess the ability to stir your emotions ever, then I just don't know how real it is for you. I mean, dudes will look at Mary and be like, oh, you know, she's a woman. Of course she was so clinging. Yeah. Really? You're the bride of Christ. You should be okay with grabbing a hold, because you've understood the depth of your own depravity. What I mean is, I don't mean you're as sinful as you ever could be, right? It just means that everything about you, right? Everything about us is affected by sin. Even the good things that you do, you're like, dang, I could find about 4 or 5 selfish motives in there, can't I? And so I'll close with this story, which many believe is the story of Mary Magdalene. We don't know that for sure, though. I just want to be clear about that. We don't know that for sure. I'm just going to read from Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's home and reclined at a table. And behold, there was a woman of the city who was a sinner. When she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who's touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answered, saying to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, saying, Teacher, a good moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which one of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you've judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he says to Simon, you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he is forgiven little, loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I just so deeply want us to be a church that understands the magnitude of his grace. I never want us to be a church that just goes through the motions and it gets hyper traditional and religious and it's all about like the stuff that's just the Christian stuff. If we can't be moved by the fact that the resurrection is evidence that your sins have been forgiven, then I don't know what we're doing. It's just a game. And I just will never be content with it being a game. So I don't know what this means to you. It's not my job to tell you what it means to you. It's my job to communicate the word as best and as clearly as I know how in my finite, Jersey-educated way. I just hope and pray we're a church that's moved. Man, how cool would it be if like the thing that marked Netcast Church was like Jesus being like, chill, stop clinging. I feel like that's pretty dope to have on your resume. Let's stand. We're going to take communion today. And I just hope that we come to the table today in awe of the grace of God. That's it. And so The bread, it represents his body that was broken for us. The juice represents his blood that was shed for us for the forgiveness of sin. I can't stand here and convince you that you need forgiveness of your sin. I'll just tell you this. I'll never forget when Ricky Grant first explained the gospel to me. And one of the things I know he said, I just remember, he's like, one day you're going to stand before a holy God and have to give an account for your life. And the reality is it won't measure up to his perfection. You've sinned. I remember when he said that, I didn't really know what the word sin meant, but I was at least had my eyes open by the Lord to be honest and be like, oh yeah, for sure, that's me. Like if I have to convince you that you're a sinner who desperately needs the grace of God, nobody's bashing your pride here. Nobody's saying like, oh, you're not a good dude. We're just simply saying like, in comparison to the holy perfection of God, you're broken and you need, if you've been created by him and are meant to return to him, you need his forgiveness. In the same way as an adulterous husband, right, needs the forgiveness of his wife to enter back into relationship. And so today, just come to the table with gratitude that you've been forgiven because of the cross of Christ. All right? Starting in the back rows, we make our way to the right, come down. Take the bread, dip it in the juice, you eat, and the band will close us out in worship. I love you.